Plague wind, what hides in the dark? By the time the wind learned his name, Elias Whitmore had already made the worst mistake of his life. He would remember the first breath of it forever. Not the screams, not the blood, not the dead eyes staring from a face that had been young and beautiful only seconds before, but that first impossible breath. It rose from the sealed dark beneath the desert, cold as a grave and sweet as rotten fruit, and it carried with it the taste of something that had waited through ages, something patient, hungry, and awake. Elias Whitmore looked around and sighed quietly. He pulled the felt hat from his head and wiped his bald scalp with a filthy handkerchief. Emptiness stretched from edge to edge. Nothing else. Unless, of course, one counted several military tents and 5 off-road vehicles. On that naked ground, under a sun that seemed to hate all living things, stood their camp. The heat was fierce, unbearable. Something similar had happened a few years earlier in Saudi Arabia, during a previous excavation, but many things had changed since then, and now the University of Boston had sent a new expedition into Iran. Whitmore lifted a plastic bottle to his lips and took a long swallow of warm water. It tasted faintly chemical, but in such heat, a man did not get to be choosy. All around the camp, cracked earth spread in every direction, brown, scorched, stripped of every trace of vegetation. Only far off on the horizon could he see the dark stripe of the Zagros Range, trembling in the blaze of heated air like a mirage ready to dissolve at any second. Sometimes Elias thought the mountains might not really exist at all. Perhaps they were only a trick of the eye, born from a temperature that climbed by noon to 47 degrees Celsius. The weather station, which Owen had installed on the very first day, recorded everything automatically. Each morning, as Whitmore reviewed the data on his tablet, his mood grew darker. The heat was worsening day by day, as if the desert were testing them for weakness. Near the tent stood a compact solar generator, its panels unfolded like a giant black flower turned toward the sky. It powered every piece of camp equipment, from laptops to the water cooling system, and hummed softly like an enormous bee. Beside it sat the desalination unit, a machine capable of wringing a few drinkable liters from any muddy puddle. Of course, no puddles had existed here for several thousand years. "Professor, we are ready," said a young graduate student from Atlanta as she approached him. Her name was Claire Mason. Whitmore nodded and let his glance move over her neat, strong body, her long legs, the chest held tight by a sports top, her shining dark hair pinned up to leave her neck bare. "I am coming," he muttered, straightening with an ache that reminded him of every year he had lived. If only he could throw off a couple of decades, then perhaps. But no. Such things did not happen. All that remained was to enjoy beautiful young bodies from a distance, while more and more often wincing at the blurred figure of his wife, with her sagging breasts and spreading waist. Fortunately, Helen had stayed in Boston this time. She hated heat, insects, and what she called his obsession with dead people. The last time she had accompanied Elias was in Peru 7 years earlier, and during the entire trip she had complained about the altitude, the food, the lack of decent coffee, and the impossibility of calling her friend Janet. Since then, Whitmore had preferred not to insist on her presence. Honestly, expeditions without her were far more productive. He could sink completely into work, without being distracted by endless grievances and phone calls in which every other word was an accusation. Claire waited patiently. She had grown used to the professor's habit of delaying. She had known him for 3 years, ever since entering graduate school. In the lecture hall, Whitmore gave the impression of being absent-minded and lazy, but the moment he reached a dig site, he changed. He became focused and demanding, sometimes far too demanding. Behind his back, students called him the Pharaoh, partly because of his domineering temper and partly because of his love for ancient civilizations. "Professor Reed asked me to tell you that he has finished calibrating the spider," Claire added, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "He says it can go in right now." "He is always in a hurry," Whitmore grumbled, putting his hat back on. "I remember in Saudi Arabia he launched a drone without checking the battery, and it crashed straight into the trench. It nearly shattered a few potsherds that were 4,000 years old. I told him then that if he ever did it again, I would send him home on a camel. Claire laughed quietly. She remembered the story, though she had not been there in person. "He has become more careful since then," she said. "No," Whitmore replied. "He has simply learned to hide his mistakes better." He rose to his feet, grimacing at the pain in his joints and hearing his knees crack. This year he had crossed 60, not an extraordinary age, and yet for some reason he felt old and broken, while some of his friends and colleagues at the same age led active lives and never complained about their health. Perhaps the fault lay in the long drinking binges into which the archaeologist sometimes disappeared. There were days when he wanted to run from everything. From his wife, who ate his brain with a teaspoon every day. From his addict son, whose treatment in a clinic cost a fortune and achieved nothing. All of it had accumulated for years, and in the end it always dissolved into a glass of whiskey at the nearest bar, and then at home into a bottle. The last serious binge had come in December, after Ethan, his son, had run away from the clinic again. The boy was 32, and still he could not master his own demons. Irony, Elias had thought then, emptying his third bottle of bourbon in one night. He was a professor of archaeology, a man who had spent his life studying ancient demons on clay tablets, and he could not cope with the demon that had settled inside his own son. Helen blamed him for everything. He had worked too much, traveled too often, paid too little attention to his family. Perhaps she was right, but being right did not make it easier. It only made the truth more bitter. Work, thank God, existed. Work allowed him to rest from all those problems by dragging his old legs around the world, from South America to the scattered corners of Europe and Asia. They had flown into Tehran 2 weeks earlier, and with permission from the authorities, had begun excavations at the site of an ancient riverbed in a remote region. Once, around the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the state of Elam had spread across these lands. Elam was one of the oldest civilizations, existing alongside Sumer and bound to it by complex, often hostile relations. The Elamites created their own writing, Proto-Elamite script, which had still not been fully deciphered despite every effort of linguists and all the power of artificial intelligence. They built ziggurats, traded, fought with Akkad and Babylon, and left behind ruins scattered across southwestern Iran. Whitmore had devoted 2 monographs to Elam and one scandalous article, in which he suggested that Elamite culture had been far more deeply influenced by Sumerian religion than scholars had previously believed. The article provoked sharp criticism from colleagues, especially Victor Hale of Yale, who publicly called Whitmore's hypothesis speculative nonsense unsupported by material evidence. Since then they had not spoken, though Elias secretly hoped that this expedition would give him the very material evidence that would shut Hale's mouth forever. They had learned of this place through records from the former capital, the city now associated with the region of Malian, ancient Anshan. There, several Sumerian tablets had been found, written by someone named Humbin. The name Humbin appeared in Elamite tradition as the name of the supreme deity, Lord of the Sky, and Whitmore had spent a long time wondering whether the author had been a priest of that god or had simply carried the name in his honor, as was common in those days. The tablets had been discovered by an Iranian archaeological group led by Dr. Farid Azari, but their content had remained untranslated for almost 6 years, until Whitmore received photographic copies through a mutual acquaintance at Tehran University. The cuneiform proved archaic, with unusual ligatures absent from standard Sumerian texts. Echo needed 3 continuous days of processing before it produced a first rough translation. When Elias read the result, his breath caught. Humbin described a temple hidden beneath the earth, in a place where 2 river channels had once joined. The temple was dedicated to a being the author called the one who carries the wind of disease. Humbin wrote with obvious terror, mixing his description with warnings, and repeating several times a phrase that Echo translated approximately as "do not wake the sleeper" in stone. Naturally, we ignored the warning, Whitmore would say later with a grim smile. Scholars always ignore warnings. It is our professional illness. 1:30, the archaeologist said aloud, squinting at the sky. The sun hung almost at the zenith, merciless and white, stripped of any shade. Shadows had shrunk into tiny dark stains beneath their feet. "Everyone in position?" he asked Claire. "Nora is developing yesterday's soil samples in the tent. Leo is helping Owen with the robot. Finn is tinkering with the drone by the second vehicle. Jack, as usual, is cleaning his weapon." "Jack is always cleaning his weapon," Whitmore muttered. "Sometimes I think he believes we are at war." "He is a former Marine, Professor. It is in their blood." "Then we begin. Enough roasting in the sun like turkeys in an oven." Claire followed Whitmore past the tents and vehicles toward the place where the excavations had been taking place for the last 2 weeks. It took only a couple of minutes to cross the entire camp and reach the mound. Several colleagues and students were gathered around a black opening in the ground. Owen Reed sat on a small folding stool, staring into a laptop screen. He was configuring a small robot on spider-like legs, whose task would be reconnaissance. The robot, which the team had simply named the Spider, was the latest model of an Arachne 4 exploratory drone, manufactured by a Boston robotics laboratory. 8-jointed limbs with silicone grips allowed it to move across almost any surface, including vertical walls and ceilings. In the front of its body was a high-resolution camera with an infrared sensor, LiDAR for 3-dimensional mapping, and a compact floodlight rated at 5,000 lumens. The robot weighed a little more than 3 kilograms and could operate autonomously for 4 hours on a single charge. Owen adored the machine, perhaps more than any person in the camp. He talked to it, giving commands aloud even though control came through the laptop. Once Whitmore had caught him polishing the Spider's casing with a special cloth and murmuring something affectionate. "Are you ever going to marry that thing?" Elias had remarked. "It is more reliable than any woman," Owen had answered seriously, without looking up from his work. On the way they passed the work tent, where the finds already removed from the earth were laid out on a folding table. There were several ceramic fragments covered with geometric ornament, a bronze spearhead turned green with age, and several dozen beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli scattered in plastic containers. Every object was labeled and entered into the database. Claire kept the catalog with a pedantry Whitmore valued, though he never admitted it aloud. Beside the finds lay an open-field journal with notes written by Elias himself in his small, illegible hand, which even Echo could barely recognize. A little farther away, under the shade canopy, stood 3 plastic crates of ground-penetrating radar equipment. It had been the radar, launched on the first day of work, that showed the anomaly. A void beneath the surface, at a depth of roughly 12 meters. The void had regular outlines, which immediately excluded natural origin. Whitmore remembered how his hands trembled when he saw the readings on the screen. Precise angles, straight lines. It could only be man-made. "Ready," Owen said with a nod, without lifting his gaze. A cigarette smoked between his teeth, and beside him stood a plastic cup of coffee long gone cold. Large drops of sweat ran down his face from under his baseball cap. "I am always ready." He lifted the robot with both hands carefully, like an infant, and set it at the edge of the discovered passage. The dark hole in the earth, framed by stone blocks, looked like an open mouth ready to swallow anything that came too close. Reed crouched and guided the Spider toward the edge. An image appeared on the laptop screen, first blurred, then sharper as the optics adapted to darkness. "Steps," Owen said, tilting his head. "They go down, angle of descent about 25 degrees. The stone was dressed roughly, but the steps are even. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "Send it," Whitmore said, folding his arms across his chest. The robot moved its limbs, gave a faint whine of servo motors, and began its descent, gripping the stone steps with the confidence of a mountain goat. Walls flickered across the screen, covered with something that at first resembled mold but proved to be only ancient dust compacted into a dense crust. Whitmore studied the recording from the inner chamber, bending so low over the screen that his nose nearly touched the keyboard. The spider's small but powerful lamp cut a dusty floor from the darkness, paved with stone slabs of remarkable precision for the Bronze Age. The ceiling, hung with webs, hovered about 4 meters above, supported by columns whose silhouettes moved at the edges of the image. The walls were covered in cuneiform, but the distance and poor light made it impossible to read more. LiDAR captured a fragment of a 3-dimensional map before the data transmission broke. The model clearly showed the outline of a rectangular hall, approximately 20 by 30 meters, with objects along the walls, niches, perhaps, or figures. Unfortunately, that was all they managed to see, because after a minute and a half the robot simply died. Owen lost contact with it, and it did not respond to requests. Telemetry stopped all at once, without warning, as if someone had pulled a plug from a socket. While the artificial intelligence analyzed the last data packets, Owen checked one connection after another and tried to restore the link. Whitmore replayed the recording again and again, staring into the laptop image. Could the stone itself have blocked the signal? Asked Nora Bell, standing a little aside with a tablet in her hands. The rock here is limestone with dolomite inclusions, Owen replied, not looking away from diagnostics. It should not shield this strongly. The spider was built to work in caves and mines. It pushed a signal through 10 meters of granite during tests. Something else then, Nora said. An electromagnetic anomaly maybe. Or a malfunction, Owen muttered, and pronounced the last word as though it caused him physical pain. A malfunction in his spider was a personal insult. Claire stood over the roboticist's shoulder, radiating the pleasant smell of perfume and the warmth of her strong body. On the other side loitered Leo Carter, a 4th-year student who kept blowing bubbles with pink gum, infuriating everyone present. Leo was not stupid, but he was irritably frivolous. He treated the dig like an adventure rather than scientific work, and this drove Whitmore mad. Carter could talk for hours about video games and virtual reality, but if asked to describe the stratigraphy of a trench, he began mumbling and confusing himself. Nevertheless, the boy had golden hands. He photographed finds with flawless accuracy, handled fragile artifacts as gently as if they were made of butterfly wings, and possessed an astonishing ability to notice tiny details others missed. "What do you think is down there, Professor?" Leo asked, chewing his gum. "A tomb, a storehouse, a secret alien bunker." "If you say the word alien one more time in my presence," Whitmore said slowly, "I will make you sieve soil for the rest of the expedition by hand and without gloves." Leo raised his hands in surrender and blew another bubble. "We will have to go down ourselves to retrieve the robot," Owen said. "We cannot just go down," Nora objected, adjusting her glasses. "We have to test the air. A sealed chamber, several thousand years without ventilation. There could be elevated radon, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, anything." "We have gas analyzers," Whitmore said, "2 portable units. One goes down on a rope, the other goes with us. Claire, prepare respirators for the whole group. Leo, check the lamps and spare batteries. Then we start preparations." Owen stretched, loosening stiff muscles, and turned his neck from side to side with a crack. Then he picked up the worn book lying beside the laptop and sank into reading with the air of a man to whom the events around him were entirely irrelevant. It was an old paper volume, read almost to pieces, its corners bent. The title was At the Mountains of Madness. Owen reread it on every expedition, superstitiously treating it as a talisman. Whitmore found the habit absurd and slightly worrying. The professor snorted loudly and walked toward the tents. He stopped at the equipment tent and took a gas analyzer from a metal case. It was a compact device the size of a palm, capable of detecting more than 30 dangerous gases. Beside it lay sealed respirators, headlamps with lithium batteries, spare rope, a first aid kit, and a portable radio. "We take everything," Whitmore ordered. "Better too careful than too dead. Leo, you carry the first aid kit, and do not lose it like you did last time in Jeddah." "I did not lose it," Carter protested. "It fell into the well." "It fell out of your hands into a 10th century well." The boy muttered something unintelligible, took the kit, and slung its strap over his shoulder. Claire meanwhile checked her camera, clicking the shutter without film to make sure the mechanism worked perfectly. She always duplicated digital shots on film, arguing that digital files could be lost, while film, if stored properly, could not. Whitmore considered it an atavism but did not argue. The results spoke for themselves. Claire's photographs had appeared in National Geographic and Archaeology Today. "All right, let us go." Claire and Leo followed him. The steps stretched into darkness, vanishing somewhere far below where the flashlight beam could not reach. Whitmore glanced back as though checking that he was not alone in this kingdom of silence, then slowly started down, placing his boots on slabs of stone coated with centuries of dust. "Perhaps we are the first people here in several hundred years," Nora Bell said softly. In the end she had come down with them, unable to bear waiting above. She had handed surface watch to Finn Cooper, who accepted it philosophically and merely said, "Fine, I will watch your backsides from up here." Nora descended last before Owen, one hand on the wall, the other holding the gas analyzer whose screen glowed green. The air readings were normal, which in itself was strange for a chamber sealed for several thousand years. "Gas analyzer is clean," she reported. Her voice bounced strangely from the walls, hollow, as if she were speaking into an empty barrel. "Oxygen normal. No toxic impurities." "Strange," Leo said. "Why strange?" "Because in a closed chamber without ventilation for several thousand years, the air composition should have changed. Organic decay, mineral leaching. But here the air is clean, as if someone aired the place regularly." Whitmore said nothing, but he marked the fact mentally. Another oddity, and one that deserved attention. It seemed they descended forever through the endless dark. Sunlight remained only as a memory somewhere above. Down here it was cool, surprisingly so, and it smelled of dust. The chamber had been in complete isolation for many centuries, and only yesterday had they opened the slab and allowed fresh air inside. For a moment the professor paused. He ran his palm along the wall. The stone was cold and smooth to the touch, almost polished. Fine dust remained on his fingers, dry and nearly weightless. He brought his hand to his nose and sniffed. It smelled mineral with a barely perceptible bitterness like old bronze. He wiped his palm on his trousers. "Notice the masonry," he said quietly, moving the beam along the wall. "Blocks fitted without mortar, so tightly that a knife blade would not pass between them. This is a technique we usually associate with later construction, or with highly developed builders." "Like Puma Punku," Leo said from the darkness. Whitmore flinched and turned. "Not exactly, but the principle is similar. Precise fitting without binding material. And this in a region where typical architecture of the period meant mud brick and clay mortar." "There is something ahead," Claire announced. Whitmore frowned, annoyed, because it was his privilege to announce what was seen. He was the one walking first, and this upstart was craning over his shoulder. Still, the professor contained himself. Not the time or place. Only a dull irritation continued to churn inside him like an idling engine. "There is a hall," Elias said loudly, holding the void scanner. Indeed, within a couple of minutes the small group emerged from the descending corridor into a spacious hall among columns. Behind and around them, when the light swept the walls, they saw murals unlike anything expected from that age. Clay tablets had been set into the stone beside the images. The first thing that struck them was the smell. Not stale, as expected, but strange and sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with something stony and ancient. Whitmore slowly moved his flashlight around the hall, and his breath stopped. No fewer than 20 columns stood in 2 rows, forming something like a central nave. As in a medieval cathedral, each column had been carved from a single block of stone and covered with reliefs of intertwined serpents, winged beings, and geometric patterns. On the floor between the columns stretched a narrow path made from darker stones, leading to the far wall where some kind of raised platform could be seen. Nora gasped and pressed a hand to her mouth. Leo whistled, forgetting his gum. Even Owen, usually indifferent to anything without microchips and wires, froze with his mouth open. "God," Nora whispered, "this is impossible." "Possible," Whitmore answered, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Before us is an underground temple complex, presumably from the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. If my assumptions are correct, this is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the century, perhaps of several centuries." "There is my robot," Owen said with relief, hurrying toward the spider-like machine and dropping to his knees. It did not move. There was no sound of servo motors and no blinking indicators. Owen turned it over and examined the underside. Every light was dead. The tester showed the battery fully charged, but the internal processor did not respond. He pressed the emergency reboot button for 5 seconds, exactly as the manual required. Nothing. He tried again, holding it for 10 seconds. The spider remained silent. "This is not hardware failure," he muttered, frowning. "Everything is physically intact. No damage, as if the entire program were simply erased." He set the robot on the floor and straightened, looking around with new caution. For the first time during the expedition, Owen Reed looked truly puzzled. "Cuneiform," Whitmore said, slowly moving his light over the wall. "Sumerian, early dynastic period judging by the forms of the signs. See these wedge impressions, made with a reed stylus in wet clay, then fired and set into the wall. Unusual practice. Tablets were usually stored in archives, baskets, shelves. Here they have been built into the wall as part of the temple itself, as a message that cannot be separated from the place." He carefully touched the edge of the nearest tablet, feeling the smooth depressions of the signs. "Excellent preservation. Fired at high temperature, not less than 800 degrees. Professional work." Leo and Nora began taking photograph after photograph. Flashes went off, blinding them for instants and snatching new details from the dark. "Astonishing," Claire said, rolling her shoulders and nodding toward the columns. "To build such magnificence and in the Bronze Age. I never knew anything like this existed." "Do not think of our ancestors as savages," Whitmore said, putting the scanner back into its case. "They were no different from us. Of course, if you brought one of them into our time, he would not understand many things. The internet, robots, spacecraft. But if we found ourselves in the distant past, we would behave exactly the same as they did. And most likely we would not last long there, despite all our knowledge." "But in books that sort of thing is fantasy," Claire began. "In reality it does not work," he cut her off. "Disease would kill us, and if disease did not, the locals would. We are simply not adapted to that time. In short, despite the divide of centuries and technologies, mentally we are about the same." "Really?" she said with a snort. "Exactly. You do not understand how a computer works. As for neural networks, you are no more than a user, just like me and like many others on this planet. There are clever people who create technologies and understand them, and there were such people in the past too, naturally, for their own time. Some understand, others use." Whitmore took a few steps and stopped to examine the wall paintings. They clearly depicted worshippers. At first it was not even clear whom they worshipped. There were plenty of figures here. The mythology was rich. "Who is that?" Claire asked, pointing her camera upward. Elias brought the light closer and stared for a long time before answering. Carved into the wall was a being with a massive humanoid body but a head that was plainly not human, crowned with horns. The body was covered in plates resembling scales, and two broad wings opened behind its back. "That is Kingu," he said at last, "one of the chthonic monsters, a child of primordial chaos. According to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, Tiamat elevated him, made him her husband and commander, and gave him the tablets of destiny. Marduk defeated him in the great battle, and from Kingu's blood humankind was created. At least, that is one version of the myth." He shifted the beam to the right. "And here see the body with traits of lion and serpent at once. This is Labu, the monster that, according to an Akkadian myth, Enlil created to destroy humans when they became too noisy and disturbed the gods. Labu was enormous. His body stretched for many leagues, and at first the gods themselves were afraid to fight him. Only Tishpak, the warrior god, dared strike the monster down." Whitmore moved farther along the wall, and the light caught another image, larger and more detailed. "And this is Mushhushu, the serpent dragon with horns, forelegs of a lion, and hind legs of an eagle, the sacred animal of Marduk. We have seen its image on the Ishtar gate in Babylon, on glazed bricks, but here it looks different, older, less stylized, as if the artist had seen something and tried to portray it as accurately as possible rather than following an established canon." He thoughtfully rubbed his gray beard, letting his eyes move from sign to sign on the clay tablets. There was no doubt that much work lay ahead. Decipherment would take a great deal of time even with artificial intelligence. He remembered Simon Drake, his former assistant and now rival, who was running his own project in southern Iraq near ancient Eridu. Drake had received a generous grant from the European Archaeological Foundation, beating Whitmore in the competition, and was now excavating what he pompously called a pre-dynastic proto-temple platform. Originally, it had been Whitmore who applied for that site. The little trader had used his connections on the committee to undercut his own professor. Now the situation had changed sharply. So far Drake had found only a few wall fragments and a couple of broken vessels, about which he reported sparingly in an academic bulletin. And Elias had this. "Good luck with the potsherds, Simon," he muttered with spiteful pleasure, stroking the edge of the nearest tablet. "This discovery will eclipse anything Drake ever finds or could have found." An underground temple with completely preserved cuneiform drawings and sculptures. Such a thing happened once in a lifetime, and it had happened to him, Elias Whitmore, a 60-year-old alcoholic with bad knees and a miserable family life. Justice, after all, existed. "Tiamat?" Claire asked, frowning. "I remember that name from your course, but vaguely." "You listened badly," Whitmore grumbled, though without malice. "In Sumerian and Akkadian mythology, Tiamat embodied the primordial ocean, the salty waters of chaos from which all things came, including the gods themselves. Together with Apsu, the fresh waters, she gave birth to the first deities. When they began to trouble her with their noise and bustle, she decided to destroy her own descendants. To do it, Tiamat created 11 monsters and gave them terrible power. This temple, apparently, is dedicated to one of those creatures, or perhaps to all 11 at once. See the figures on the floor. Exactly 11. Claire lowered her camera and looked down. Indeed, along the central path, at regular intervals, stood clay figurines, each no more than 30 centimeters tall. They represented beings of the strangest forms. Some combined features of different animals, others looked almost human but with distorted, grotesque proportions. "The 11 monsters of Tiamat," Whitmore repeated, and his voice sounded almost reverent. "Kingu, Labu, Mushhushu, Bashmu, Ugalu, Ushimgalu, Kusariku, Urmalalu, Girdablalu, Kulalu, and Umudabrutu. Their names sounded like a chant in prayers and spells. They were feared and honored at the same time." He pointed ahead toward a raised platform on which lay a single clay tablet. He approached it cautiously, ignoring the voices of his colleagues behind him, ignoring the flashes of cameras, wholly absorbed by his goal. This, perhaps, was the main treasure of the place. "And who is he?" Claire asked. Pazuzu, son of the god Hanbai, Whitmore said. Chief of all demons. We know something about him from mythology, but so little that we can almost say we know nothing. The professor coughed and cleared his throat. Formally, he continued, leaning one hand on a column, Pazuzu does not belong to the canonical group of Tiamat's 11 monsters. He stands apart. In Assyrian texts, he is called the king of the wind demons, lord of fevers. Bronze amulets bearing his image have been found across Mesopotamia, from Nineveh to Ur. The paradox is that his image was used as protection against another demon, Lamashu or Lamashtu, who stole infants. People had to call upon one demon to defend themselves from another. Imagine what kind of world they lived in, choosing between two evils. That does not sound too different from ours, Claire said. Whitmore looked at her with unexpected respect. Perhaps you are right. When he reached the platform, he pulled out another smaller device and turned it on. It was a latest generation optical scanner capable of reading cuneiform from clay tablets and transmitting the image directly to Echo for analysis and translation. The device, the size of a pocket flashlight, emitted a thin fan of infrared light that entered the microscopic depressions of the signs and created a three-dimensional map accurate to 1/100th of a millimeter. Whitmore slowly moved the scanner over the tablet, and on the handheld screen an image began to form, sharp, with contrast shadows revealing every wedge-shaped imprint. The text is two-sided, he said, leaning lower. The main inscription is on the front. The back, judging by what is visible along the edges, has some notes, perhaps instructions or warnings. We will have to turn it over when we finish. Data streamed instantly into the handheld device, and translated words began to appear on the screen. Surprisingly, the artificial intelligence produced the translation quickly. This is an incantation, Whitmore said. An address to Pazuzu. It was hidden here from Babylonian priests in distant lands, so they would not destroy the only true words capable of calling the archdemon into the world. His throat had gone dry from excitement, but no water bottle was nearby. Wait, Nora said from the far wall, tablet in hand. Are you saying this is an actual ritual text, not merely a literary fragment or a copy of a myth? Exactly, Whitmore nodded, his eyes glittering in the flashlight beam. Most tablets we find are household records, legal documents, correspondence, literary works. But sometimes we find incantation texts, shiptu, used by priests in ritual practice. Spells against disease, appeals to gods, protective prayers. This text, however, resembles nothing known. It does not ask for protection. It summons. And you are going to read it aloud? Nora asked carefully. Echo will read it, Elias corrected. For linguistic analysis, we need to hear the phonetic reconstruction, to understand the structure, rhythm, meter. Sumerian incantations had strict rhythmic organization. They were closer to poetry than prose. Nora exchanged an uncertain glance with Leo, but he only shrugged and blew another gum bubble. Look at the image, the professor said. Here is the demon himself. Human body, dog head, scorpion tail. This was how the ancient people of Mesopotamia imagined him, although in some myths Pazuzu had a lion's head. Whitmore hesitated for 1 second, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in his chest. A fleeting premonition, which he immediately dismissed as foolish superstition. Then he touched the screen and gave the command. Echo. The artificial intelligence began reading the phonetic reconstruction in a pleasant female voice, using a model of Sumerian pronunciation built from Akkadian transcriptions and comparative analysis of hundreds of known texts. The words sounded guttural, rhythmic, with repeated syllables rising in tone like a drum roll. The echoes in the underground hall multiplied them, turning the voice from the speaker into a choir of ghostly voices that filled the space. The professor noticed that Leo had stopped chewing. Nora took half a step back. Owen lifted his head from the spider and frowned, listening. At the very instant the last word was spoken, a storm of dust rose inside the temple, and from somewhere there came a foul, icy wind. It lasted no more than a few heartbeats, but that was enough for amazement and fear. When visibility cleared, at first glance everything in the chamber seemed unchanged. The handheld device blinked in Whitmore's hand, showing the translated words. Claire stood nearby, frozen with her camera, and the others were still among the columns. The flashlights flickered together all at once, as if by command. For a fraction of a second the temple drowned in absolute darkness, so thick and tangible that Elias felt it wrap around him physically, like cold water. Then the light returned, but it had changed. Dimmer, yellower, as if the batteries had drained by half in a single instant. The handheld device in his palm squealed and restarted. On the floor, one of the clay figurines, the one showing a winged creature with a dog's head, split in two without any visible cause, with a dry click as if a spring inside it had snapped. "Are you all right?" Whitmore asked, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder. She turned sharply and stared at him with milky eyes. Her beautiful face was covered with a web of gray veins, and her skin had changed, becoming gray and loose, like that of a 200-year-old woman. Her blackened upper lip lifted, revealing ugly yellow teeth. "Do you like me like this?" she shrieked. The voice belonged to Claire and to something else at the same time, something ancient and womb-deep. Two voices sounded in unison. One high, human, the other low and vibrating, coming from somewhere deep in the chest, from the place where a living heart beats. And Elias understood with blinding clarity that Claire's heart no longer beat. Before him stood a shell, and inside it something had settled, something that had broken from an imprisonment lasting millennia. He had no time to answer. A blow like an iron hand hurled him several meters backward. He crashed among the clay statuettes, the 11 beings of the demon pantheon. Some cracked and burst into shards, others toppled into cracks in the floor. Claire, or whatever she now was, lifted into the air, swaying slightly above the dusty stone, then rushed at Whitmore with hands extended and fingers crooked. Elias managed to roll aside, straining every old muscle, avoiding the strike and hiding behind the pedestal with the tablet. "Where are you going, old man?" the thing buzzed, giggling thinly. After the words it pushed out an impossibly long tongue, moving it with wet sounds. Thick saliva dripped to the floor, smoking on the slabs and leaving deep marks. Whitmore sprang to his feet, but a moment later the demonic creature pinned him to the wall. It still hovered in the air like a cursed witch, exuding the stink of a corpse. Nails scraped his flesh, tearing skin, trying to reach his neck, to drive fingers into it and rip, rip, rip. "I smell hot blood," it hissed. "Your blood." Leo Carter came from behind, grabbing the creature by the shoulders and throwing the body back. But the monster was in the air again and pounced on him with a malicious hiss. The demon woman's fingers plunged into the student's mouth, stretching it, tearing it apart. Blood poured out, and an animal terror burst from Carter's throat. He kicked and sobbed, trying to throw the creature off, but in vain. "That smile suits you better," she kept shrieking. Leo jerked his head, and the torn cheeks shook with his movement, spraying dark fluid in every direction. Bloodied teeth shone in the uncertain light of several lamps. Owen rushed in, swinging the spider robot and striking the back of the creature's head with all his strength. The skull made a wet slap, and clumps of hair remained caught in the mechanism. Claire snapped her head around 180 degrees with a crack and fixed milky eyes on him. "You filth!" Owen shouted. The vile face spread into a terrible smile. She rose with lightning speed, knocked his arm away, and drove both thumbs under his eyelids into the sockets. With an easy motion she pulled out his eyes. Mucus and blood burst out, and Owen screamed, staggering backward. Bloody tears ran down his cheeks, and a choking gurgle came from his throat. One eye dangled on its nerve, fully torn from the orbit. Whitmore drew a Swiss Army knife from his pocket and threw himself forward, driving the blade into the creature's chest and knocking it to the slabs. They both fell, but the archaeologist landed on top. With his other hand he struck the head, the jaw, the nose, the horrible black lips. Pain burned through his knuckles. What is happening? One lonely thought flashed through his mind. Claire only giggled thinly, mocking his pathetic attempts. Then Elias gripped the handle more firmly and drove the blade into her neck, deeper and deeper, trying to sever the head from the body. Green blood poured out, nearly transparent but tinted like grass. The wound widened gradually, until the knife met an obstacle and struck the bone of the spine. "Do not look at me," the archaeologist shouted. "I am not guilty, you damned." He ripped the slime-coated blade free and hacked again and again at the monster's filthy face, cutting and mutilating it. From the demon's throat still came the hateful giggle, like a broken doll stuck in motion. At last Elias fell backward, gasping, wheezing air from his lungs. His heart stung unpleasantly and blood thudded in his temples. He rose heavily on stiff legs, leaning against the wall and looking around. Wind blew through the temple, yet somehow it passed around him, straight through the center of the hall and up toward the staircase. "Professor, are you all right?" Nora Bell approached hesitantly from behind the nearest column. Her face was white and her lips trembled. She held a flashlight in both hands. "Yes, probably," Whitmore answered uncertainly, as though he himself did not fully understand whether he was still alive. "What happened to her?" Nora nodded toward Claire's motionless body a few steps away. "I think it was the incantation." Whitmore coughed. His throat felt even drier than before. "We called an ancient being into the world, Pazuzu. They also called him the plague wind, and now I do not know what disasters this threatens for us." He moved to the groaning Owen and helped him stand. Reed pressed his hands to the places where his eyes had been, and blood seeped between his fingers. Or rather, to the place where they had been, for now there was only a wet emptiness. "Help Leo," Whitmore ordered. Nora rushed to Carter, who whimpered and shook. She kept glancing at Claire's still body, but apparently the creature was dead, since it lay with its head half severed. "This was a great mistake," Elias sighed. "Who could have known those words would have such consequences?" Nora asked. "But now it is over," she added hopefully. "She is dead." "I hope so. Now, child, move toward the exit. We must help our people." He would call Shiraz and request help, but how long would it take the authorities to reach them? And should they tell them everything at all? The camp lay on a flat surface stretching for dozens of kilometers, but beyond it rose the mountains. If help arrived, it would arrive by helicopter, and the local people would hardly be pleased by what the Americans had done. Attitudes toward the United States here were, if not hostile, at least suspicious. Even permission to dig had been won with enormous difficulty. And now this. "My eyes," Owen howled on the stairs. "What happened to them?" Whitmore looked at the roboticist's face, at the empty blood-filled sockets and the eye dangling on its nerve, and said nothing. The sight made him sick. Medicine had advanced far enough to place bionic eyes on the market, but what agony was Owen enduring right now? Hard to imagine. Leo too, though his cheeks were only torn. A plastic surgeon would perform another miracle, and perhaps not even scars would remain. "Tell me what happened to them." Owen sobbed in a voice that suddenly sounded like a child's. "We have to hurry," the archaeologist said instead. They emerged outside into a dust storm. The wind blew from the west, carrying icy cold. Ahead stood the tents and several vehicles, but Whitmore's eyes fell on the Hummer H7, model year 2037, built for civilian use. The group moved toward it when shots cracked from the side. Once, then again. Then came a heart-tearing scream and a growl. Something terrible was happening beyond the curtain of dust. "What the hell?" Owen groaned, clutching his face and screaming as sand entered the fresh wounds. "Curse it," Whitmore snapped. Squinting, he watched a figure hurry toward them and felt in his pocket for the Swiss Army knife that had served him so well below. A couple of seconds later his muscles loosened, though his heart continued pounding hard enough to ache. It was only one of the students, Finn Cooper, a thin, red-haired young man. "Professor," he cried in astonishment. He looked around like hunted prey, then ran toward the small group. "What is happening here?" Whitmore demanded. I do not know, damn it. Some of ours suddenly changed and started attacking the rest. And Hoblick, I have never seen anything like it. Whitmore reached for the driver's door, then froze as though remembering something. He pulled the handheld device from his pocket and switched it on. His eyes widened in surprise, immediately filling with dust, but that single second was enough to confirm what he had to do. "We have to get out of here," Finn shouted. "Bloody hell," Whitmore said. "Get behind the wheel." He stepped back, took the flashlight from Nora, and watched as Owen and Leo got into the back seat. The Hummer door slammed shut. Finn stared at him as if he had gone mad. "What the hell are you planning?" "I have to stop this." "How?" Whitmore shook his head, leaning forward to keep balance against a strong gust. A plastic chair flew past him, then a piece of canvas. "I have to do it now, or soon the whole world will drown in this ravenous storm. Plague and wind. Those are the two elements of Pazuzu, but there is another. He can command the living, placing a piece of himself inside them, breathing filth into them as God breathed life into man." "Then to hell with all of it," Finn shouted. "First flight to the States. There will not be enough seats for everyone." Whitmore waved for Cooper to drive instead of standing there. Finn obeyed. A few seconds later the Hummer, ignoring the sandstorm and roaring with its powerful engine, tore away from the camp toward the broken road. At least Elias wanted to believe they would find the path to safety in almost zero visibility. Bending low, Whitmore ran back, but after a few meters he stopped abruptly, running into Jack, the head of security. The large man from Dallas was sniffing, turning his head. "There," he said, "beast." His milky eyes stared blindly around, ignoring the flying dust and sand. Fresh purulent ulcers covered his cheeks and forehead. Whitmore prepared for the attack, but from somewhere to the side came a deafening woman's scream, and Jack dissolved into the storm, vanishing from view. Reaching the entrance, the archaeologist slipped inside and began descending the familiar staircase. It seemed only an hour had passed since their group had come through here, knowing nothing, and yet it felt like an eternity. It was hard even to believe what was happening. Nevertheless, it was happening. Behind him reigned chaos. The possessed were killing people. If Elias did not want this to spread across the planet like cancer, he had to stop the plague at any cost. Lighting the way with his flashlight, Whitmore descended into the temple and swept the beam over Claire's lifeless body. The once beautiful face now looked hideously deformed, but he tried not to look at it. He passed the corpse and stopped near the platform with the tablet. Again he took out the handheld device and studied the text. Echo could not read the incantation backward. That would have been useful, because perhaps the reverse would produce the opposite effect and force Pazuzu out of this world, sealing the demon in prison again. No matter, he could do it himself. Whitmore turned at a sound, feeling movement at the back of his head. The flashlight beam caught Claire's twitching corpse. Muscles fluttered as if electrical impulses ran through them. The hair on his scalp stirred with fear. He wanted to drop everything and run as fast as his legs would carry him, only to get away from that terrible place. But no, he had to do this for all humankind. To hell with everything else. The girl's corpse suddenly shot into the air, and the creature made the rasping sound of a dead thing. The milky eyes again pierced the world of the living with their icy stare. The spine arched, breaking something in the back with a wet crack. Dark blood burst from the mouth like a fountain, running down the chin, staining the top and jeans. With the fluid she belched 2 words. "Possessed one." A whirl of dust spun around her. Long hair whipped and moved like the snakes of Medusa. Her arms rose with enormous speed, eager to seize the hated man. But the archaeologist was ready. He slipped out of the deadly embrace and dropped to the slabs. The possessed one rushed past and struck the wall face first, smashing her features and breaking her nose. There it was. He had to act faster. The end was close. Small stones from the floor struck his face, leaving bloody marks. Without wiping them away, Elias rolled onto his stomach, breathing hard, staring at the handheld screen and beginning to read the words backward. Sumerian cuneiform was not natural to an ordinary person. It was read from right to left, and each pictogram meant something. Nevertheless, the incantation had been constructed with genius simplicity. From right to left, it summoned. From left to right, it imprisoned. Astonishing that he had not noticed earlier. Not so astonishing, perhaps, because events had spun too quickly. The plague wind had used the loophole and slipped from its prison. Claire flew at Whitmore, grabbing his hair and yanking hard, laughing and growling at the same time like a madwoman, stretching black cracked lips and baring her teeth. Her swollen tongue writhed in her mouth like a fat slug trapped in too small a hole. "Do you no longer like me like this, old man?" He definitely did not like her like this. So Elias drove his fist between her eyes, and the monster's head snapped back, only by a miracle not flying from the nearly severed neck. "You foul stinking piece of flesh," she hissed, spraying saliva. "Old age is no joy. I smell the rot in you. The grave is calling you. Soon worms and rats will eat the flesh your sins have spoiled." One of the wall tablets tore loose and struck Whitmore in the forehead. Another followed, then another and another. The archaeologist tried to dodge, but his years were no longer kind and he was exhausted. Clay cut his face and hands, its sharp edges leaving shallow gashes. "Be damned," he shouted in despair. "You will be damned," came the answer, followed by bubbling laughter. Nothing now remained of the once beautiful graduate student. Before him was a true monster, born from sick imagination. Milky eyes stared coldly at the worm sprawled beneath her. From the torn wound in her neck seeped blood or something like it. The possessed one hovered above the ground, arms spread. "Now come to me," it ordered in a rough bass voice, beckoning with a long finger and broken nail. Whitmore moved forward, not with his body but with his soul. His spirit slowly began to separate from the physical shell, sliding out as a snake leaves its skin, drawn toward the call. He had to obey this ancient being, old as the world. It had been born from darkness itself, from Tiamat. Pazuzu had existed when Christ hung on the cross. He had existed even earlier, in ages long covered with moss and legend. And his bride, people whispered, was Lilith herself. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing an abyss. Into it the archaeologist leaned with all his essence, craving the submission of the weak before the strong. Then a bright point appeared in the dark, and a thunderclap followed. The abyss slammed shut, and the creature's head burst apart in bone and brains. Whitmore blinked repeatedly and turned. Finn Cooper stood there holding a Desert Eagle Mark 7 from the year 1992. Old weapon, reliable weapon. "Where did you get that?" Marcus almost said, but Elias corrected himself through the days. "Where did you get it?" "Jack lent it to me," Finn answered casually, waving the heavy pistol. "True, it cost him a hand. Son of a bitch never liked me. Too pompous." "But you left." "Not far. Echo went down, so no satellite connection. The autopilot was no help and I would never get out alone, so I decided to come back. The others stayed in the Humvee, and as I can see, I was just in time." He nodded toward Claire's still twitching headless body. From above came the footsteps of new possessed ones. They were hurrying to stop the professor from doing what he intended, but Whitmore began reciting the incantation from the beginning in reverse. After only a minute, he finished and held his breath, waiting. "It worked," Finn said, raising an eyebrow and turning. The laser sight on the Desert Eagle jumped along the walls and toward the exit. No one appeared. The dust storm in the temple had died, as had the flying clay tablets. It all happened almost boringly, ordinarily. No spectacle, no blaze of divine light. One moment, then nothing, as if someone had flicked a switch. They climbed to the surface and surveyed the ruin of the camp. Many lay without signs of life, both members of the archaeological expedition and some local workers. There were living people too, unpossessed, because the others had been dealt with. Survivors emerged from hiding cautiously, looking around. "It is over," Finn Cooper said. "Over for that thing." He lit a cigarette from a crumpled pack, still holding the Desert Eagle. Smoke gathered above his head, strangely untouched by the wind. "Almost," the archaeologist answered. Whitmore hurled the tablet with the incantation to the ground, and it broke into several pieces. Then he began grinding it under the heels of his boots, crushing it to dust. "Now it is truly over," Elias said. Pazuzu gnashed his teeth and stared into the blackness of the abyss. Some mortal, a pathetic sack of bones, had driven him back into this timelessness, this endless void. The demon ground his fangs, and the sound rang through nothingness, finding no walls from which to rebound. Then his gaze slid toward a line of light that widened into a gate. From some unknowable place emerged a colossal being whose outline could not be held by the eye. Its form changed every moment. It was like a thundercloud filled with thousands of lightning bolts. Rings of fire revolved around it, and at its center burned 7 eyes, each looking into a different age. "Anu," the archdemon whispered in the void. "Anu, Lord of the heavenly vault, ruler of the gods, father of all deities, the one whose tiara crowned the axis of the world." Pazuzu had not seen him since the beginning, when heaven separated from earth, and Anu took his throne in the highest sphere. Moments later another figure appeared behind Anu, and the demon felt an icy current pierce his dead flesh. From the darkness floated a being wrapped in streams of water, shining and black like molten glass. The streams wound around his body and flowed into the abyss, forming rivers that ran from nowhere into nowhere. This was Enki, lord of the fresh subterranean waters, god of wisdom and magic, the most cunning of all who dwelt beneath the heavens. Both high ones stopped in the light of the glittering gate and looked at the archdemon. Pazuzu bowed, but not too low. After all, he had been born of primordial chaos, of the darkness that existed before the gods, and yet rarely had he seen those two in one point of space. Anu ruled the sky and almost never left his throne. Enki dwelt in the underground ocean of Pazuzu, occupied with endless designs and subtle plans. Their joint appearance promised nothing but judgment. "What brings you here?" Pazuzu asked calmly. His voice showed no emotion, but inside he boiled with fury. Some mortal had managed to defeat him and send him into the abyss for an unknown span of time. Perhaps the High Ones had come to release him from prison. Enki, after all, was famous for his unpredictable nature. He had saved humankind from the flood against the will of his own kin, who knew what plans matured in his many-layered mind. "Why do you not answer me?" Enki moved, and the streams of water around him changed direction, forming for a moment a sign like a fish devouring its own tail. Still no answer came. Then Pazuzu saw a chariot racing toward him, drawn by 2 Mushushu sacred dragons. Marduk drove it, conqueror of Kingu and Tiamat, supreme god of Babylon, son of Enki. In his hand was the famous bow, and from his shoulder hung a net woven of the winds from the 4 corners of the world. The abyss itself seemed to move under the roar of the dragons. A mighty wind struck the demon and filled his dead lungs. His milky eyes opened wide. "Son of the pure sky," the archdemon said to Marduk with reverence, bowing much lower this time. "How many times will you break the law?" Marduk thundered, breathing hurricanes and whirlwinds. "Once you were defeated and exiled into the abyss to remain there forever. You violated the law of creation by invading the world of the living again." "My followers," Pazuzu began. He wanted to say it was not his fault. Humans had built the temple themselves, had hidden the summoning tablet that could be used once in 3,000 years in distant lands. But whom was he deceiving? A deity could not be tricked. Least of all Marduk, who had once torn Tiamat in 2, made heaven and earth from her body, and hung a constellation on the sky so the gods could watch the passage of time. "No excuses," Marduk said. Enki finally spoke, and his voice was like the murmur of a deep underground stream. Calm, measured, without anger, and therefore more frightening. "You are cunning, Pazuzu, more cunning than most creatures of chaos. You made humans wear your amulets, pray to you, feed you with fear. You found a loophole in the structure of the incantation and waited. For millennia you waited until someone would speak the necessary words. But cunning, son of Hanbai, will not save you from justice. Marduk raised his bow and drew the string. The arrow upon it shone like a blade heated white. The dragons in the chariot harness roared, and their roar shook the abyss until space itself vibrated. Your flesh will be torn apart, Marduk said, and for you to restore yourself again, infinity itself will have to pass. That meant never. The demon understood that no words would help. He threw himself away into the blackness of the abyss, but a violent stream of wind stopped him. His innards filled with storms blown from Marduk's mouth, tearing his flesh with a crack. At the same time, Enki stretched out his hand, and the waters of the deep rushed over the demon, flooding the ruptures, not healing but dissolving, washing away his very essence as water washes a clay tablet and turns written words into meaningless mud. Anu watched silently from above, and under his gaze the last threads binding Pazuzu to existence fell apart. The archdemon simply burst, scattering into countless fragments. Marduk's wind seized them and drove them through the abyss into its farthest, deadest corners, from which there is no return. The incantation has already been used, Marduk said thoughtfully, lowering his bow. That cannot be undone. He turned to his father. Enki, wisest of the wise, return all things to their circle as they were, with one exception. The tablet of summoning must be erased from the memory of stone. Let humans find the temple. Let them study the walls and figures. But the words that call chaos must vanish forever. Enki inclined his head, and the streams around him changed direction. They flowed backward, curling into a spiral, washing time, mixing the moment as a potter's hands mix clay. And you, Anu, Marduk said to the Lord of the Sky, open the gate into the world of the living. There must have been something here, Whitmore said, stretching his hand toward the platform. Perhaps some artifact. He looked at Claire Mason as if she were somehow guilty, then turned away and studied the pedestal more closely. The stone was completely smooth, without marks of attachment, dents, or scratches, as if nothing had ever stood upon it. But that contradicted the entire logic of the temple. A central pedestal, reached by a stone path and framed by 11 demon figures, could not be empty. It was an altar without an icon, a frame without a painting. Strange, he muttered, taking out the scanner and passing it over the surface. No traces. No micro-scratches, no organic residue, no mineral deposits. Absolutely clean stone. Claire bent beside him and aimed the camera at the pedestal. Maybe a scroll lay here, she suggested. Papyrus skin, something that could have completely decayed. Then traces would remain, Whitmore said. Organic acids leave characteristic stains on stone. Here there is nothing. Absolutely nothing. He straightened, grimacing at the pain in his lower back. He looked around the hall. Overall, everything was in place. Columns, drawings, tablets, figurines. Everything except whatever should have been on this pedestal, a mystery that perhaps would never be solved. No, unlikely, the professor said, shaking his head, almost speaking to himself. The entrance was sealed. You saw that yourself. Claire nodded, holding the flashlight. Although perhaps I am wrong, Elias added, and finally waved the thought away. There were enough artifacts of the past here even without it. Every wall was covered with cuneiform and drawings, and the floor held figurines of demons. All right, Whitmore exhaled, slapping his thighs. Enough standing around. We have work, a lot of work. The professor smiled, and the wrinkles around his eyes gathered into a whole net of fine lines. He imagined the fame he would receive when the world learned of this. He imagined Simon Drake's face when he saw the publication in Archaeological Review. He imagined Victor Hale's face. He even imagined Helen's face, though with her narrow mind she would hardly understand the significance of the discovery. Nora, bring the camera here. We need complete panoramic shooting of the hall, every wall, every column, and launch LiDAR. I want a true three-dimensional model. Claire, light here. I need to scan the upper row of tablets. Claire raised the flashlight, and the beam slid along the wall, revealing endless rows of wedge-shaped signs born from the hand of a person who had lived in a world where gods and demons were not metaphors, but daily reality. Elias Whitmore stared at those signs, and for a moment it seemed to him that he recognized something in them. Some word, almost rising in memory like a bubble from the bottom of a deep lake. Then it burst before reaching the surface. He blinked, and the sensation disappeared. "Professor, are you all right?" Claire asked, noticing how he had frozen. "Yes," Whitmore answered, turning his eyes from the wall. "I thought I saw something." He did not know what he thought he had seen, and a second later he had already forgotten it, sinking back into work. Behind him, in the depth of the hall on the empty pedestal, lay a thin stripe of dust. A draft from nowhere lifted it and carried it into the darkness, up the staircase, toward the desert where a merciless white sun shone and a steady dry wind moved, carrying bitter grains of sand from the mountains.